On the morning of September 11, 1960, a group of boys exploring a garbage dump in the foothills south of Denver found what they first mistook for discarded clothing piled against the dirt. They were wrong. The remains of Adolph Herman Joseph Coors III had been there for months. He was 44 years old, chairman of the most secretive major brewing company in America, a husband and the father of 4 children. He had been dead since February, killed by a man who had planned his abduction for months, and who, when kidnapping went wrong, disposed of the evidence with the cold efficiency of someone who had decided that a human life was a problem to be managed. The Coors family never fully recovered. They responded to the murder the way they responded to everything, by sealing themselves off, controlling every piece of information, and converting grief into armor. The armor became an empire. The murder made both possible. Adolph Coors arrived in America in 1868 at the age of 21. He was German from Barmen in the Rhine province, and he brought with him what German immigrant craftsmen of that era reliably carried: technical skill, extraordinary patience, and a conviction that quality, consistently applied, was the only reliable path to anything worth building. He worked his way across the country in stages that left no recorded account of his interior experience, only the sequence of decisions and their outcomes. He arrived in Colorado during its first serious gold rush expansion and recognized what prospectors consistently failed to see. The men selling equipment and comfort to miners made more reliable money than the miners themselves. But Coors was not interested in picks or dry goods. He was interested in beer. In 1873, he partnered with a confectioner named Jacob Schuler and established the Coors Brewery in Golden, Colorado, a small city set against the base of the Rocky Mountains, roughly 15 miles west of Denver. The location was not chosen for scenery. Golden sat directly on Clear Creek, a mountain waterway fed by snowmelt from the upper Rockies, producing water of a purity and mineral consistency that the industrial cities of the eastern seaboard could not replicate. In brewing, water is not incidental to the product. It is the product's molecular foundation. The grain matters and the yeast matters, but the water determines the fundamental character of everything that follows. Adolph Coors had found, in Clear Creek, a competitive advantage that he recognized immediately and protected for the rest of his life. He bought out Schuler in 1880. He ran the company alone from that point, with the specific intensity of a man for whom failure was not a philosophical abstraction, but a lived memory from a country that hadn't given men like him much space to recover from it. He drove quality standards that were unusual for regional American brewing in the 1880s and 1890s. He reinvested profits rather than extracting them for public display. He expanded in careful step with distribution capability rather than in advance of it, which meant the growth was slower. But the foundations were never ahead of what could actually support them. Prohibition arrived in 1920 and nearly killed the company he had spent nearly 5 decades building. Most American breweries that survived the 18th Amendment pivoted awkwardly to near beer and malt syrup, products nobody particularly wanted from a brewer. Coors converted the industrial infrastructure toward malted milk and cement production. Businesses that used existing equipment and kept the workforce employed through 13 years that eliminated hundreds of American brewing companies permanently. The brewery survived. The family held it. Then Adolph Coors did something that no competitor, no market force, and no government had managed. In May 1929, he fell from a window of the Cavalier Hotel in Virginia Beach, Virginia. He was years old. The death was ruled a suicide, The family said almost nothing, then or subsequently. Silence was not incidental to the Coors character. It was definitional. His son, Adolph Coors Jr., assumed control, guided the company through the Depression, and built the post-war business that would make the family genuinely prominent. The groundwork was set. What the next generation would do with it was still unwritten. Adolph Herman Joseph Coors III was born in 1916, the eldest son of Adolph Coors Jr., and the grandson of the man who had built a brewery from creek water and German technical discipline. He came of age inside one of the most unusual family cultures in American business, a family that had, by the 1930s, achieved genuine and substantial wealth, while maintaining the specific interior focus of immigrant-founded enterprises that have survived enough difficulty to trust almost nothing outside their own walls. He attended the Webb School in California and then Cornell University, where he completed an education in engineering. The family's preference for engineering was not arbitrary. Engineering is precise. It produces results you can measure with instruments. It rewards exactness and penalizes approximation in ways that other disciplines allow you to disguise. These values fit the Coors character, the way the mountain landscape fit the brewery, naturally, without adjustment, as though both had been designed with the other in mind. He served in the army during the Second World War and returned without the visible damage that some men brought back from that period, but with the quality that military service reliably imposed on men of his generation and background: a directness of manner, an impatience with unnecessary formality, a preference for doing the work rather than discussing the work at length before doing it. He was not a man who inhabited meetings comfortably. He was a man who wanted to know what the actual situation was and then address it. He joined the company not at the top, but in the middle, moving through operational roles with the pragmatic seriousness of someone who understood that the family name on the building was not a substitute for understanding what happened inside it. By 1960, he was chairman. The title reflected genuine operational authority over a business that had grown substantially through the post-war decade. What consistently confounded people who met him expecting the conventional posture of a major company chairman was the gap between his position and his personal manner. He was warm, not performatively warm, but genuinely interested in the people around him, in a way that people on the receiving end of it invariably noticed. He remembered details of previous conversations. He asked real questions rather than performing curiosity as a social lubricant. He maintained a consistency of engagement with people, regardless of their position in the company's structure, which, in the hierarchical culture of 1950s American business, was unusual enough to be remarked upon. He was also, physically, a man of particular presence. He was athletic in the way of men who treat outdoor activity not as recreation, but as the natural condition of existence. He rode horses seriously, played polo with competitive engagement, hunted in the mountains he had grown up looking at, fished the same streams that fed the creek that made the family's beer distinct. He was comfortable in physical space and in physical effort, in a way that executive life rarely maintains. None of this is incidental detail. It explains the particular quality of vulnerability that his personal habits created, because the contrast between his actual prominence and his lived simplicity was precisely what made him accessible. He drove himself to work. This fact was noted by investigators after the fact with the particular weariness of people who could see exactly how it had contributed to what happened. He drove a 1959 International Travelall, a vehicle so deliberately functional that its choice was itself a kind of statement about how he understood his own life. Not a luxury automobile, not a chauffeured arrangement, not a security-conscious choice of route or timing. He drove the same vehicle on the same roads at roughly the same times, with the casual consistency of someone who had not yet encountered a reason to vary any of it. The route from the Rangeview estate to the Golden Brewery ran through the Jefferson County foothills on roads that were scenic and not particularly busy. He had driven it hundreds of times. The landscape was familiar in the way that landscapes become familiar when you've moved through them regularly across years. Not consciously observed but unconsciously absorbed, the specific quality of morning light at different seasons, the condition of the road surface in different weather. He had married Mary Grant in 1942, during the war years. They had 4 children, Cecily, Adolph IV, Jim, and Spike. By February 1960, the children ranged from roughly 8 to 17 years old. A spread across developmental stages that meant the household was always full of the overlapping energy of children, moving through different phases of growing up simultaneously. Mary was a woman whose character would not be fully visible to the outside world until the crisis of 1960 demanded it. She was educated and privately composed in the way that women of her social position in that era were expected to be publicly contained. She was deeply invested in the family's private life, without any apparent interest in the social performance of wealth that some of her peers pursued. The Coors family culture of self-reliance extended even into domestic arrangements. The family did not maintain the extensive household staff that comparable families in their position commonly employed. The company itself was in an unusual position in the American brewing landscape of the late 1950s. Coors beer was distributed across 11 western states and sold nowhere east of the Mississippi River. This was not a marketing failure or a distribution oversight. It was the deliberate consequence of the company's decision to skip pasteurization before packaging, a production choice that the company believed produced a fresher and cleaner product, but that required refrigeration throughout the entire supply chain and made long-distance distribution genuinely difficult to maintain standards the family insisted upon. The geographic limitation had produced a cultural paradox that the company had not planned and could not have manufactured. Beer that you could not get was beer that people wanted with a specific intensity that available beer cannot generate. Travelers returning from Colorado brought cases of Coors in their car trunks. Businessmen on Western trips packed cans in checked luggage. The scarcity imposed by the distribution limitation became, entirely without deliberate cultivation, one of the most effective brand mechanisms in the American consumer goods market. Gerald Ford reportedly stocked it on Air Force One. Paul Newman was publicly associated with it. The mystique was real, and it was worth more than any advertising campaign the company might have designed. This meant that by 1960, the Coors name was associated in the American imagination primarily with the Western landscape, with quality linked to a specific geography, and with the particular desire created by things that cannot be easily obtained. What it was not associated with, in any public or visible way, was the family that owned and ran it. The Coors who appeared in newspaper coverage of the time were business figures in the Colorado context, significant locally, nearly invisible nationally. The company issued the minimum disclosures that private ownership allowed, which for a family-owned company with no public shareholders was extremely little. No annual reports for public consumption, no executive profiles in national business publications, no family members photographed at the kinds of social events that wealthy families attend and that put their names in the society pages of major newspapers. Information about the family's finances, the company's operations, and the daily habits of the people who owned and ran it was controlled with a discipline that most public companies cannot achieve, even when they try. The discipline served a function. A family that controls its information controls the narrative that surrounds it. A family that controls the narrative controls the perception others have of it. In a business environment where the Coors brand's value was substantially tied to the image of Western authenticity and family tradition, that narrative control had real commercial value. But information control is not physical security. The Coors family had built an extraordinary apparatus for managing what the world knew about them, what they had not built, and what the culture of self-reliance and personal independence that defined their daily habits made it psychologically difficult to build was a meaningful apparatus for managing who could approach them. Adolph Coors III left the Rangeview estate on the morning of February 9th, 1960, in his international travelall, on his usual route, at his usual time. He was expected at the brewery by mid-morning. He was a man in the full exercise of his life, running a company his grandfather had built, raising 4 children with a woman he had been married to for nearly 2 decades, living in a landscape he loved in a manner that reflected what he actually valued, rather than what his position suggested he should value. He did not arrive at the brewery. The first call came from the company. Then Mary Coors made her own call to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Then the investigation that would consume the next year and a half of the family's life, and parts of all the lives that followed, began moving. The morning of February 9th, 1960, was cold and clear in the Jefferson County foothills. The overnight temperature had dropped into the low 20s Fahrenheit, and the ground along Turkey Creek Road was iron-hard with frost that the weak winter sun had not yet reached. The mountains above Golden were clear, the kind of clarity that high altitude produces after a cold night. The peaks specific and close-seeming, the sky behind them a particular shade of winter blue that photographers drive considerable distances to capture. Turkey Creek Road wound through the foothills between Morrison and the higher elevations to the south and west, a 2-lane mountain highway that served local ranch traffic and the occasional through traveler. But that was not, on a Tuesday morning in February, a busy road. The specific section that concerns this story crosses Turkey Creek itself on a bridge, a functional, unremarkable span over a seasonal waterway that ran with snowmelt in spring and ran lower and slower in winter, its surface partially frozen by February temperatures, but not completely solid. Adolph Coors III had crossed that bridge dozens of times, perhaps hundreds. It was part of the route, unremarkable in the way that familiar things become unremarkable through repetition. On the morning of February 9th, that bridge was where his ordinary morning ended, exactly what happened on or near. That bridge has never been established with the precision that investigators and the family's surviving members might have wished. The encounter between Adolph Coors III and the man who had positioned himself there was witnessed by no one who subsequently gave a clear account of it. What investigators found when they arrived told a story in physical evidence, partial, suggestive, and definitive enough to establish the essential facts without filling in the specific seconds of what one human being did to another. The 1959 International Travelall was found stopped in the road on the bridge. The engine was still running when investigators arrived. Inside the vehicle, on the front seat, was a thermos of coffee, positioned as though the driver had simply stepped out for a moment with every intention of returning. There was no sign of violent struggle inside the vehicle itself. The interior was undisturbed in the way that interiors are undisturbed when someone exits willingly, or exits quickly enough that the disruption occurs outside rather than in. On the railing of the bridge, investigators found blood. The specific amount and distribution of the blood on the railing was inconsistent with a minor injury. It was also inconsistent with an accident. An accidental fall against the railing would have produced a different pattern in a different position. The blood was where it would be if someone had been struck or had struck the railing with force while standing outside the vehicle and fighting. Below the railing, on the frozen ground beside Turkey Creek, investigators found additional evidence of disturbance. The frost had been broken and displaced in ways consistent with a struggle, or with something or someone being moved across the ground. There were marks in the frozen earth that ground conditions had preserved with a clarity that would have been impossible on softer soil. Adolph Coors III was not there. Mary Coors had placed the call to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office after her husband failed to arrive at work and could not be reached by phone. The initial response treated the situation as a missing person report, a category that, in rural Jefferson County in 1960, covered a wide range of possibilities from traffic accident to breakdown to something more serious. The 2-hour gap between expected arrival and the call was consistent with a minor incident that had resolved before a search could begin. The discovery of the abandoned vehicle, the running engine, and the blood on the bridge railing moved the situation out of the missing person category within the first hour of the investigation. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office notified the FBI within hours of the initial scene investigation. The Bureau had federal jurisdiction under the Lindbergh Law, federal legislation passed in 1932 in the specific aftermath of the kidnapping and murder of Charles and Ann Lindbergh's infant son, which established that the transportation of a kidnapping victim across state lines was a federal offense. The law also established a presumption of interstate transportation if the victim was not returned within 24 hours, which meant the FBI could engage almost immediately in a case where foul play was evident. Agents from the Denver field office arrived at Turkey Creek Road within hours of the initial discovery. They documented the scene with the methodical thoroughness of an agency that had developed kidnapping investigation procedures across nearly 3 decades of the Lindbergh Law's operation. The vehicle was processed. The railing was processed. The ground disturbance was photographed and documented. Samples were collected. The scene told investigators a set of things with reasonable certainty and left others open. It told them that Adolph Coors III had stopped on the bridge, or had been stopped on the bridge, and had gotten out of, or been removed from, the vehicle. It told them that blood had been shed at or near the railing. It told them that whatever had happened had left him no longer in possession of his vehicle, his thermos, or his expected Tuesday morning. What it could not tell them, with the physical evidence alone, was whether he was alive or dead at the point where the physical trace ended, whether the blood on the railing was the consequence of a struggle during an abduction, or the consequence of something that had already ended a life, was a question the scene could not answer definitively. The amount of blood was significant, more than a minor wound typically produces, but not so large in volume that death at the scene was established beyond alternative interpretation. Investigators proceeded on 2 simultaneous assumptions: that the victim might be alive, in which case every hour of delay cost leverage in any potential negotiation, and that he might be dead, in which case the investigation of the crime took precedence over any ransom arrangement. These two tracks ran in parallel through the first days and required different operational priorities to be maintained simultaneously. The family was the first source of background information. Investigators spoke with Mary Coors and with company officials to establish the most basic facts. Who knew Adolph III's daily routine? Who might have observed it? Whether there had been any previous threats or unusual incidents, whether the family had any reason to suspect any specific person or category of person. The answers to these questions were, in most respects, consistent with the profile of a man whose life was organized around genuine simplicity rather than careful security management. His daily habits were known to the people around him. Family, ranch staff, brewery employees, people who lived on or near the roads he drove. His route was observable by anyone who took the time to observe it. His departure time from Rangeview was not a secret. He drove the same vehicle consistently. The combination of observable routine, predictable route, and the absence of any security protocol meant that whoever had chosen to target Adolph Coors III had selected a target who could be studied, timed, and approached without requiring exceptional capability or inside knowledge to locate. A witness who lived near Turkey Creek Road reported having seen an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the bridge on a previous morning, the day before the disappearance, or possibly the morning of. The vehicle was a light-colored car, possibly yellow, possibly a Mercury. The witness had not noted the license plate, but had noticed the vehicle because it was parked in a location that was unusual, neither at a property nor in a formal turnout, but in the particular nowhere of a parked car whose driver has not gotten out for any obvious reason. This witness account became one of the early focal points of the investigation and would prove, in the subsequent weeks, to be one of its most significant early pieces of information. The family maintained, through the first days of the investigation, the composed exterior that the Coors culture required, and that Mary Coors's particular character reinforced. She did not speak to the press beyond a brief statement asking for privacy and for the public not to interfere with the investigation. She engaged with federal investigators cooperatively and completely. She managed her household, including 4 children ranging in age from 8 to 17, children who understood that something had happened to their father, but who were being protected from the full weight of what investigators were already beginning to suspect. The brewery continued operating. Company management issued statements that were precise to the point of saying almost nothing. Adolph Coors III was missing. The family was cooperating with authorities. No further information was available at this time. The culture of information control that had always characterized the family was now being applied to a situation where controlling information was a genuine operational requirement rather than merely a preference. Every piece of information that became public was a piece of information that the person who had taken Adolph Coors III could use. Keeping the investigation's specific findings private was not just instinct. It was strategy. The Jefferson County foothills fell into their usual February stillness. The creek ran below the bridge at its winter level. The frost came every night and left every morning. The travelall was gone, catalogued into evidence. The bridge was as it had always been, functional, unremarkable, and now the site of something that the county had never previously encountered. The family waited. The investigators worked, and somewhere, on roads that left no trace, the man who had been waiting at that bridge drove away from what he had done and made his calculations about what came next. 2 days after Adolph Coors III disappeared from Turkey Creek Road, a letter arrived at the family's home. The envelope was addressed to Mrs. Coors. The letter inside was typewritten. It was precise in the specific way of someone who had prepared it before the events it referenced, not composing in the heat of crisis, but deploying something already written, already calibrated. It demanded $500,000 in cash, assembled in specific denominations that the writer described in methodical detail. It provided instructions for how the money was to be packaged and how the writer would communicate delivery arrangements. It warned, in the flat language that such letters typically employ, that any contact with law enforcement would endanger the person being held. The FBI was already in the house. This was the kidnappers' first and most significant operational failure, and it was one that the investigation would build on over the following months. The warning embedded in the ransom note, "Stay away from the police," or "Consequences follow," functions only when it arrives before any contact with law enforcement has occurred. It is a threat designed to create a window of compliance during which the kidnapper can control all available information and all potential actions. When the threat arrives 2 days after the kidnapping, after the family has already involved federal investigators who are already processing the crime scene, already interviewing witnesses, and already running a parallel investigation, the threat lands in a context where it cannot function as intended. The letter had been postmarked in Denver. The timing of the postmark established that it had been mailed within hours of the events at Turkey Creek Road, suggesting that the writer had carried it already prepared and had dropped it in a Denver mailbox on the same day the crime occurred, before leaving the Denver area. This sequencing was itself informative. It suggested someone who had planned the sequence of events in advance, who had prepared communications that would be deployed at specific points in the operation, and who had intended to be mobile, away from Denver. Before the letter reached its destination, the FBI handled the letter with the forensic rigor their kidnapping protocols required. Document examination was a developed discipline by 1960, and the Bureau had laboratory resources capable of extracting significant information from typewritten materials. The typing characteristics of the letter were analyzed in detail. Each typewriter of the era produced subtle but identifiable variations in the way individual keys struck the ribbon, variations that could, with sufficient reference material for comparison, connect a specific document to a specific machine. The letter's paper was chemically analyzed. The envelope's adhesive was examined. Every physical component was documented and entered into the investigation record. The examination produced findings that, while not immediately identifying, were consistent with a picture that was beginning to take shape from other investigative directions. The yellow Mercury remained the central physical lead. The witness account from Turkey Creek Road, the car parked in the nowhere of a roadside spot where parked cars have no obvious reason to be, had further, through canvassing, additional witnesses in the area of Turkey Creek Road and the surrounding foothills roads were identified and interviewed. Their accounts were variable in precision but consistent in a direction, a light-colored vehicle, appearing on multiple mornings in the days before the disappearance, parked at points along the route that Adolph Coors III regularly drove. The pattern of the vehicle's appearance was not random. It was concentrated on the route, at times consistent with the target's typical morning passage, across a period of multiple days. Someone had been timing a commute. Someone had been identifying the most isolated point on the route, the bridge over Turkey Creek, where the road narrowed and where a vehicle stopped in the middle of the span would have no easy exit option and had selected it as the location for whatever they planned to do. Colorado motor vehicle records were searched for yellow Mercury sedans registered in the Denver area. The search produced a manageable number of registrations, and these were cross-referenced against the other investigative leads the Bureau was developing. One registration stood out. A yellow Mercury was registered to a man named Walter Osborne, with an address in Denver. The name was not immediately recognized as significant. It did not appear in any law enforcement database as a known criminal. The address was a Denver apartment. Investigators went to the address within hours of identifying the registration. The apartment was occupied, in the sense that furniture remained inside, and personal items were distributed across the space in the ordinary way of a lived-in residence. It was unoccupied in the sense that the person who lived there was gone. Not gone in the way of a planned departure, with packed belongings and closed accounts, but gone in the accelerated way of someone who left quickly when leaving became necessary. Clothes hung in the closet, items sat on shelves, food remained in the kitchen in stages of various freshness. The departure had the specific texture of flight rather than relocation. The apartment was processed with the same forensic thoroughness that had been applied to the bridge scene and to the ransom letter. What investigators found inside provided the most direct connection, yet between the investigation's multiple threads. Typing materials in the apartment were consistent with the typewriter that had produced the ransom letter. Document examiners, working from the letter's characteristic typing patterns and from the materials recovered in the apartment, established the connection with a confidence that would become central to the prosecution's subsequent case. The ransom letter had been typed in that apartment, or on equipment that had been in that apartment. Additional items recovered during the search connected the apartment to the planning of the crime. Maps, materials relevant to the logistics of staging an abduction on an isolated mountain road. Evidence of research, the kind of accumulated detail that a person accumulates when they are learning a target's habits rather than simply happening to observe them. Walter Osborne had studied Adolph Coors III's daily life. He had identified the route, the vehicle, the timing, and the vulnerability point. He had prepared the ransom letter before executing the plan. He had prepared an escape route that took him away from Denver before the letter arrived. And before investigators connected his apartment to the crime, the FBI now had a name, Walter Osborne, and an apartment full of evidence connecting that name to the kidnapping. What they did not yet have was the man himself. Checks on Walter Osborne's background in Denver were completed quickly. He had lived in the apartment for several years. He had held employment at a Denver area business during that time. He worked as a shipping clerk, a position that would have generated minimal scrutiny and required minimal documentation of his actual identity. He had paid his rent consistently and on time. He had not attracted attention from neighbors or co-workers in any documented way. The man had been, by every available surface indicator, an entirely ordinary Denver resident. He had a job, he paid his bills, he kept to himself. He existed in the city the way that a large percentage of urban residents exist, present but unremarked upon, filling a social role without generating any particular attention. He had been living this way, investigators would eventually establish, for nearly 5 years. The 5-year duration was the first indicator that whatever Walter Osborne actually was, he was not a person for whom maintaining a false identity while planning a crime was an unfamiliar cognitive state. Most people cannot maintain a false identity for 5 years without error, without a document that doesn't match. a story that doesn't cohere, a detail that produces a question they can't answer. The discipline required to live as someone else for 5 years in a city, holding a job, interacting with people across hundreds of ordinary social encounters is not ordinary. The FBI broadcast Walter Osborne's name and physical description through law enforcement channels. A photograph from materials in the apartment was distributed. The investigation entered the phase of tracking a man who was already gone, whose head start was measured not in hours but in days, and who had demonstrated a capacity for methodical planning that made the assumption of a quick capture unreliable. The family received no further communication. After the initial ransom letter, the silence from Walter Osborne was complete. No follow-up contact, no proof of life. No secondary communication establishing delivery instructions for the $500,000 the letter had demanded. Nothing. In kidnapping investigations, the cessation of communication after an initial contact is one of the most specific and terrible indicators available. Communication requires the kidnapper to have something they need from the victim's family, specifically the ransom money. When communication stops, the most probable explanation is that the dynamic that made communication necessary no longer exists. The family was not told this explicitly. It was understood implicitly by everyone in the investigation and managed with the specific professionalism of people who have learned that maintaining hope is a humanitarian obligation, even when the operational read has moved past it. Through February and into March, the Coors family lived in the specific suspended state that unexplained disappearance imposes on the people left behind. Neither the clarity of confirmed tragedy nor the relief of resolution, but the grinding middle space where every day's absence is evidence of something, but not proof of anything definitive. The mountain winter continued. The creek ran below the bridge, and Walter Osborne, whoever he actually was, had put significant distance between himself and what he had done. The name Walter Osborne did not belong to the man who had used it. That much was established relatively quickly once investigators began examining the background of the alias with the resources the Bureau could bring to bear. The social security number associated with the name led nowhere productive. The documented history connected to it had gaps that a real life does not contain. The Walter Osborne, who had lived in Denver for 5 years and held a job and paid his rent, was a constructed person, an identity assembled from pieces rather than lived from birth. The real man behind the alias was Joseph Corbett Jr. He was 33 years old in February 1960. He had been born in Seattle, Washington, and had grown up in California. He had attended the University of California and had, by the academic record that surviving documents reflected, demonstrated a genuine and measurable intelligence. The performance in the courses he completed was not that of an average student performing adequately. It was that of someone with real analytical capability who might, in different circumstances and with different interior architecture, have built a life that used that capability productively. He had served in the army and received an honorable discharge. He had worked various jobs in California in the early 1950s, accumulating the ordinary resume of a young man in his mid-20s without yet a fixed direction. In 1951, he picked up a hitchhiker on a California highway and killed him. The victim was an Air Force serviceman, and the investigation that followed his death was conducted by California law enforcement with the evidence available at the crime scene and through witness accounts. Joseph Corbett Jr. was identified, located, and arrested. He was tried for first-degree murder and convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison and transported to the California Institution for Men at Chino. The motive was never established to the satisfaction of anyone who examined the case, either then or subsequently. There was no robbery. The victim's valuables were not taken. There was no prior relationship between killer and victim, no documented grievance, no comprehensible personal logic to the killing in the categories that criminal investigations typically employ. The hitchhiker had been traveling. He had accepted a ride. He had been killed by the person who offered it. The absence of conventional motive is not, in forensic psychology, the same as the absence of all explanation. It suggests a particular category of psychological organization, one in which the ordinary constraints that prevent most people from harming others are either absent or selectively engaged. This is not a satisfying explanation in the way that human beings typically want explanations to be satisfying. It does not provide the comfort of comprehensibility, but it is consistent with what Joseph Corbett Jr. subsequently demonstrated across the years that followed his conviction. He was a model prisoner. This requires some care to understand, because the phrase model prisoner carries implications of reform that are not necessarily operative in all cases. A model prisoner is someone who behaves according to institutional requirements consistently enough that the institution's management assigns them improved conditions, greater trust, and increased operational freedom within the facility's constraints. This behavior is measurable. It reflects performance, consistent, observable, documented performance over time. Joseph Corbett Jr. produced this performance across years at Chino. He complied with institutional rules. He engaged with programs. He received the assessments that accumulate trust in prison environments. The documentation of his behavior during incarceration was, by the standards that parole boards and prison administrators apply, genuinely positive. What the behavior reflected about his interior, whether it represented actual change, or whether it was the same capacity for sustained, disciplined performance of a role that had killed one man in 1951 and would kill another in 1960, is a question that neither prison administrators then nor forensic psychologists subsequently have answered with confidence. In August 1955, working in a minimum security arrangement that his accumulated good behavior had made accessible, Joseph Corbett Jr. walked away from his work assignment and did not return. He crossed into Colorado. He established himself in Denver. He adopted the name Walter Osborne, an alias he had constructed with sufficient documentation to support surface-level examination, and began the process of building a life that would be his cover and his preparation simultaneously. He found the shipping clerk position at a Denver business. He paid his first month's rent, and his second and his third, and continued doing so without interruption for nearly 5 years. He interacted with co-workers and neighbors across hundreds of ordinary social encounters without generating suspicion in any of them. He was, to every person who knew him as Walter Osborne, simply a quiet man who kept to himself and caused no trouble. What he was doing underneath the surface performance of ordinary Denver residency was planning. The reconstruction of the planning process, assembled by FBI investigators from the physical evidence in the apartment, from the behavioral pattern of the crime, and from the various investigative analyses conducted both before and after Corbett's eventual trial, is remarkable for its scope and its patience. He had selected his target not through proximity or opportunistic access, but through research. The Coors family's wealth was not secret. Their identity as owners of the Golden Brewery was publicly known in the Denver metropolitan area, even if it was not extensively publicized nationally. The specific target, Adolph III, rather than another family member, was selected with what investigators concluded was deliberate logic. He was the chairman of the company, which implied the highest ransom leverage, and his daily habits, which were considerably more predictable and less protected than one might expect from a man in his position, made him accessible. Corbett had studied the route. He had driven it, probably multiple times, establishing the geography, identifying the points of isolation, noting the timing of traffic and the presence or absence of witnesses at various locations along the road. The Turkey Creek Bridge presented the specific combination of isolation, physical constraint, and approach angles that the plan required. A vehicle stopped on a bridge has nowhere easy to go, forward, back, or the railing. The bridge's position meant that approach from multiple directions was possible, while observation from any fixed point was limited. He had observed the commute. The witness reports of the Yellow Mercury parked on the route across multiple mornings in the days before the kidnapping establish that Corbett was timing Adolph Coors III's passage, confirming the regularity of the schedule, establishing the precise window within which the encounter would occur. This is surveillance conducted systematically and patiently, with the same discipline that had produced 5 years of unremarkable Denver residency. He had prepared the ransom letter in advance. The letter's tone and specificity are consistent with something composed in the controlled conditions of the apartment rather than in the chaos following a confrontation. The denomination instructions for the money, the delivery mechanism framework, the specific warning about law enforcement. These are the elements of a document written by someone who had time to think carefully about what the document needed to accomplish. He had arranged an exit route, the evidence of his departure from Denver, the empty apartment, the pattern of a quick departure from a long-held position, is consistent with someone who had established the escape logistics before the plan was executed. The Yellow Mercury, which he drove east across the country following the events at Turkey Creek Road, and which was eventually burned near an Atlantic City, New Jersey dump site, was his primary escape vehicle. Burning it eliminated the most identifiable physical connection between himself and the crime, while putting him on the eastern seaboard, where transportation options for further movement were extensive. He crossed into Canada shortly after disposing of the vehicle. The planning was sophisticated. The execution was not, in a specific and critical sense. He had not accounted for one scenario with adequate contingency, the target resisting physically. Adolph Herman Joseph Coors III was 44 years old and maintained an active, physically demanding life. He was a man who rode horses and played polo and hunted in mountains. He was not a man who surrendered his autonomy without contesting it. Whatever happened on that bridge, whether Coors fought the approach, whether he moved toward the railing to escape or was pushed toward it, whether the violence was initiated by one party or escalated rapidly from an encounter neither party fully controlled, the confrontation did not go as Corbett's planning had structured. The blood on the railing was evidence of that failure. The gunshot evidence eventually established at the site where the body was found was evidence of the consequence. Adolph Coors III was shot, whether the shot came in the context of a struggle or came after. The struggle had reached a specific point is a question the forensic record does not definitively resolve. What the forensic record resolves is that he did not survive. He did not. Morning of February 9th, 1960, the man who left the Rangeview estate in his international travelall, with a thermos of coffee on the seat beside him, was dead before the ransom letter he never knew about arrived at the house he had come from. Corbett spent the subsequent 7 months, from February through September, while the investigation ran, and the family waited, and the FBI distributed his alias photograph across American law enforcement. Somewhere outside the United States, or in a part of it where he could be sufficiently invisible, the investigation knew his alias. It knew his physical description. It knew enough about his planning and execution to have a psychological profile that was useful in predicting his behavior. What it did not know was where he was. That would require a tip, and tips require a photograph reaching the right person at the right time. The Federal Bureau of Investigation placed Joseph Corbett Jr. on the 10 most wanted fugitives list in May 1960, 3 months after the events at Turkey Creek Road. The 10 most wanted list was at that point a 12-year-old institution, established in 1950, initially as a publicity program developed in cooperation between the Bureau and the Associated Press, and subsequently transformed into a genuine law enforcement tool whose effectiveness rested on the intersection of public attention, media distribution, and the mathematics of large populations. The premise was direct. If the right person sees the right photograph at the right moment, geography becomes irrelevant. A fugitive can be anywhere. The photograph can be everywhere. The encounter that produces recognition can happen at any scale of proximity to the original crime. The list had produced captures. Its record through 1960 included individuals located through tip-line calls from citizens who had seen the wanted photographs in post offices, in newspapers, or in the documentary radio and television segments that the Bureau's public affairs operation cultivated. The mechanism worked because American civic engagement with law enforcement information was, in the mid-20th century, substantially higher than subsequent decades would maintain. Corbett's photograph was distributed through the standard channels: post office bulletin boards across the country, newspaper syndication, radio bulletins, early television news programming. The physical description that accompanied the photograph was detailed: height, weight, approximate age, specific physical characteristics that his years of outdoor and physical activity had produced. The alias Walter Osborne was included in the distribution, along with the note that additional aliases were possible. The distribution produced the volume of tips that 10 most wanted listings typically generated, significant in number, inconsistent in quality, requiring individual evaluation and in many cases physical follow-up by local law enforcement or Bureau field offices. Each tip that involved a possible Corbett sighting required assessment. Did the description match? Did the location make geographical sense, given known movements? Was the reporting person credible in their account of what they had seen and why they believed it was significant? Most tips went nowhere. This is the statistical reality of fugitive investigations, and it is the aspect of such investigations that most documentaries and narratives understate. Because the procedural work of evaluating and eliminating tips does not translate well into compelling story. It is also the work that makes captures possible when they occur, because the capture is the narrow end of a funnel, whose wide end is built from exactly that kind of methodical, unremarkable evaluation. The investigation maintained 2 parallel tracks through the spring and summer of 1960. The first was the fugitive manhunt, the distribution of information, the evaluation of tips, the maintenance of coordination between the Denver field office and Bureau offices in other regions where Corbett might surface. The second was the continuing development of the evidentiary case against him, the building of the prosecution's record from the physical evidence already gathered, ensuring that when Corbett was located, the case against him was ready to move forward without delay. The The second track also carried a subsidiary investigation that the family had not fully accepted, and that investigators managed with the professional care appropriate to the situation. The continuing accumulation of evidence that Adolph Coors III was dead. The ransom letter had produced no follow-up. 7 months had passed with no contact. The blood on the bridge railing and the quantity of that blood were consistent with injuries that did not produce survivors. The investigation was treating the case as a homicide from a relatively early stage, while maintaining the formal posture of a kidnapping investigation until physical evidence resolved the question definitively. In September 1960, that resolution arrived. The boys who found the remains on September 11th were exploring a garbage dump in the foothills south of Denver, the kind of site that exists in the semi-rural edges of expanding western cities, where the detritus of household and commercial disposal accumulates in locations that are not supervised, not maintained, and not regularly visited except by people with specific reasons to go there. Children exploring such sites are a consistent feature of American suburban and semi-rural life, and the specific pattern of discovery. Children finding something that adults had not found, through routes that adult investigation had not prioritized, is not unusual in cases where remains have been concealed in locations chosen for their lack of obvious value. The discovery established through physical evidence at the site and through the subsequent forensic examination conducted by Jefferson County investigators, working with the Bureau, several things that the investigation had been constructing toward and waiting to confirm. The remains were identified as Adolph Herman Joseph Coors III through physical evidence consistent with his identification and personal items found with the remains. The condition of the remains was consistent with approximately 7 months of outdoor exposure in the conditions of the Jefferson County foothills across the late winter, spring, summer, and early fall. The forensic examination of the recovered materials established the manner of death. He had been shot. The family was notified. The official case status shifted from kidnapping to homicide. The investigation continued on the same tracks, but with a different legal framework. The man they were looking for was now a murder suspect, and the charge was first-degree murder under Colorado law. Mary Coors received the news at the house her husband had left 7 months earlier. What the notification looked like from inside that house, the specific character of a grief that had been held in suspension for months, that had continued existing underneath the surface of daily management and family maintenance, and that now had its definitive confirmation, is not recorded in any public document and was never described by Mary Coors or by the children who were present in that household. The silence is consistent with everything else about how the Coors family managed the interior of their experience. In Vancouver, British Columbia, a man named Thomas Waldron was living in a rooming house and working at a paint store. He had been in Vancouver for some period of months, established in the pattern that had characterized his Denver years. Regular employment, consistent rent, minimal social footprint. He was Thomas Waldron in Vancouver, the way he had been Walter Osborne in Denver, present enough to function, invisible enough to avoid any attention that might require him to produce documentation or account for his history with anyone who had reason to check it carefully. He had crossed into Canada from the eastern United States sometime in the months following the events at Turkey Creek Road, using a route and a means of transportation that the investigation was never fully able to reconstruct. The specific logistics of how Joseph Corbett Jr. moved from the Atlantic City area where the yellow mercury was burned, into Canada and subsequently to the Pacific coast, remained a gap in the documented record. He arrived in Vancouver. He established himself. He began the performance of ordinary life that he had sustained for 5 years in Denver, with apparent ease. The tip that ended his Canadian residence came from a Vancouver citizen who had seen the wanted materials distributed through Canadian law enforcement channels in connection with the Bureau's manhunt. The cooperation between American federal law enforcement and Canadian authorities in fugitive cases had been formalized through agreements that the Bureau maintained with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the distribution of wanted materials through those channels was a routine component of major fugitive investigations. The citizen who recognized the photograph in late October 1960 connected the image to a man they knew as Thomas Waldron. The call to local Vancouver police set off a notification chain that moved quickly from municipal police to the RCMP to the Bureau's Denver field office. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police moved on the address provided by the tip on October 29, 1960. Officers approached the residence in the manner appropriate to the apprehension of a suspect wanted for murder in a neighboring jurisdiction. The man inside was Joseph Corbett Jr. He did not resist. He went through the arrest process cooperatively, which is consistent with the behavioral pattern of someone for whom institutional compliance is a practiced mode, rather than a meaningful choice. He provided his alias initially, and then was identified through the physical evidence that the Bureau's records contained. He said very little. He did not explain himself. He did not provide an account of where he had been or what he had done. The silence was familiar. It was the same silence he had maintained across 5 years of Denver residency. Not the silence of a person who has nothing to say, but the silence of a person who has calculated that saying nothing serves their interests better than the alternative. The extradition proceedings that followed took months. Canadian extradition law required the requesting jurisdiction to establish a prima facie case, to demonstrate to the satisfaction of a Canadian court that sufficient evidence existed to support the charges for which extradition was sought. Corbett's lawyers challenged the proceedings at multiple procedural points, using the legal architecture of extradition requirements as a delay mechanism, rather than as a genuine defense on the merits. The challenges did not succeed. The evidence assembled by the Bureau and by Jefferson County investigators satisfied the Canadian court's requirements, and extradition was approved. In April 1961, Joseph Corbett Jr. was transferred to Colorado authorities. He was transported to Jefferson County, where the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office had been preparing the prosecution's case across the months of the investigation and the extradition proceedings. The case they had built was not dependent on a confession. It was built from physical evidence: the apartment, the ransom letter, the vehicle trace, the forensic connections between Corbett and the crime scene, and from the investigative record that established his planning, his movements, and his flight. It was built to stand without him saying a single word. That was fortunate, because he never did. The trial that was about to begin would last several weeks, produce a verdict that most observers considered the only one the evidence supported, and leave unresolved the questions that verdicts rarely resolve. Why the specific target? Why the specific plan? And what exactly happened in the seconds on that bridge when everything went wrong? Those questions went to trial unanswered and came out the other side in the same condition. The trial of Joseph Corbett Jr. opened in the Jefferson County District Court in the spring of 1961 and proceeded with the measured pace that complex criminal cases involving extensive physical evidence typically require. Gallery was consistently occupied. The case had generated sustained public interest through the year-plus of investigation, and the combination of the Coors family's prominence, the duration of the manhunt, and the specific human drama of the story drew observers from across the Denver metropolitan area and beyond. The Jefferson County District Attorney prosecuted the case personally, which reflected both the case's significance and the strength of the evidence that had been assembled. Prosecutors in serious cases where the evidentiary record is weak tend to insulate themselves through institutional distance, assigning the trial to capable subordinates while maintaining the ability to comment from the sideline. When the evidence is strong and the case is high profile, the political calculus typically runs in the other direction. This was a strong evidence case, and the prosecution approached it accordingly. The structure of the prosecution's case rested on several categories of evidence that independently and collectively connected Joseph Corbett Jr. to the crime. The first was the physical connection between Corbett's Denver apartment and the ransom letter that had arrived at the Coors' home 2 days after the disappearance. The document examiners who had analyzed the letter's typing characteristics and who had examined the materials recovered from the apartment during the initial search testified about the specific findings. The correspondence between the letter's typing patterns and the typewriter consistent with materials found in the apartment. The paper analysis. The physical evidence chain that established the letter's production in that location. This testimony was technical and required the jury to follow a chain of forensic reasoning that was less immediately accessible than more direct forms of evidence, but it was presented by witnesses whose qualifications were established and whose methodology was documented. The second was the vehicle. The yellow Mercury had been identified through witness accounts and vehicle registration records, traced through its registration to the Walter Osborne alias, connected through that alias to the Denver apartment, and eventually confirmed as having been driven east and burned in New Jersey following the crime. The vehicle's destruction was itself evidence of consciousness of guilt. An innocent man does not burn his car on the eastern seaboard 2 days after a kidnapping in Colorado. The timeline of the vehicle's movements, reconstructed through toll records, witness sightings, and the eventual recovery of burned materials in New Jersey, placed Corbett in a pattern of flight consistent with someone who had committed the crime and was eliminating evidence. The third was the apartment evidence more broadly, the materials that connected the space to the planning of the crime, the maps, the materials relevant to logistics of approaching and leaving the Turkey Creek area, the accumulated detail of research into the Coors family's daily movements. These items were individually explicable as innocuous. In their combination in the specific pattern of what they represented when considered together, they constituted what the prosecution characterized as a planning kit, the assembled resources of someone who had been preparing for this specific action over a period of time. The fourth was the flight itself, the departure from Denver, the cross-country journey, the vehicle burning, the movement to Canada, the adoption of a new alias, the maintenance of that alias across months until RCMP officers knocked on the door. This pattern of behavior, extended across time and geography, was not the behavior of someone uninvolved in a crime who had been in the wrong location and panicked. It was the behavior of someone who knew what they had done and had calculated correctly that remaining in the United States would eventually produce capture. Each evidentiary category was presented through witnesses who could speak to specific components of it from direct knowledge or documented expertise. The prosecution did not rely on any single thread of evidence, but wove the multiple threads into a picture that each individual juror could follow from their own particular engagement with the material. The defense had limited options. The physical evidence was what it was, and challenging its authenticity would have required either demonstrating specific failures in the collection and documentation protocols, failures that the methodical Bureau investigation had not produced, or advancing an alternative explanation for why all of these items existed in the relationship the prosecution had described. The defense strategy focused primarily on the sufficiency of the evidence as a legal matter, rather than on constructing an alternative narrative. The argument was essentially that the evidence, while extensive and circumstantially powerful, did not meet the legal standard for the specific charge of first-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt, that it demonstrated proximity to the crime and subsequent flight. But that proximity and flight, without a confession or a direct witness to the specific act of killing, left the jury with reasonable uncertainty that the prosecution had not overcome. It was a narrow argument. It was the argument available in the circumstances. It did not produce the result the defense sought. Joseph Corbett Jr. did not testify. This decision was legally his right and strategically defensible. A defendant's decision not to testify cannot be used as evidence of guilt by the jury, and testimony opens a defendant to cross-examination, in which a prosecutor can develop points that damage the overall defense position. Given the specific evidence in this case, and the specific qualities that cross-examination of Corbett might have explored, the decision to keep him off the stand was rational. He sat at the defense table through the proceedings with the quality of controlled exterior that had characterized his entire life, as documented by the investigation. Present, observing, cooperative with the court's procedural requirements, revealing nothing about his interior. Mary Coors was present in the courtroom through the significant portions of the proceedings. She was there for the opening, for the key evidentiary testimony, and for the verdict. She was accompanied by counsel and by family representatives who managed the practical aspects of her attendance without generating the press interaction that the family's instinct and the specific sensitivity of the circumstances both counseled against. She watched the proceedings from the gallery in the specific composure that everyone who observed her through the year, from February 1960 to the spring of 1961, would subsequently describe in consistent terms. Not the composure of someone who has suppressed her response to events, the particular performance of containment that grief sometimes produces in people determined not to let it show. The composure of someone who has made a decision, internally and privately, about what the subsequent hours and days, and eventually years of her life require from her, and who is executing that decision without visible struggle. She was 45 years old. She had 4 children at home. She was watching the trial of the man who had taken her husband from a bridge in February and left his remains in a garbage dump in September. She sat through it. The jury deliberated for a period consistent with the complexity of the case and the volume of evidence they had received. The deliberation was not brief. This was not an open and shut case in the sense of direct witness testimony or physical evidence of the killing itself, but it was not extended in a way that suggested genuine, unresolvable division among the jurors. The path from the evidence to the verdict was navigable. On March 29, 1961, Joseph Corbett Jr. was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Adolph Joseph Coors III. The sentencing followed in accordance with Colorado law as it existed at that point. First-degree murder carried the penalty of death or life in prison, with the jury or the court making that determination in accordance with the specific legal framework. Corbett was sentenced to life in prison. He was returned to the Colorado State Prison System, to the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cañon City, where he would begin serving a sentence that the court had imposed with the specific legal term, meaning what it literally said, the remainder of his natural life. The family received the verdict without visible public reaction beyond what the lawyers and representatives present conveyed to the press in brief, factual terms. The conviction had been obtained. The sentence had been imposed. The legal resolution of the case was complete. Resolution and justice are different things in cases like this one, and the difference is most visible, not in the courtroom where the verdict is read, but in the subsequent years, when the people most affected by the crime continue living with it in ways that verdicts do not address. Adolph Coors III was dead. He had been dead for 14 months when the conviction was entered. The legal system had done what it could do, assigned responsibility, imposed consequence. It had not answered the questions that the family and the broader public carried from the case. What had specifically happened on that bridge? What the precise sequence of events had been in the minutes between the approach of the yellow Mercury and the blood on the railing? What had been in Joseph Corbett Jr.'s mind when he selected this man from this family on this road and decided to approach him? Those questions were never answered. They are not answered now. The trial produced a verdict. The verdict produced a sentence. The questions remained. In Cañon City, Joseph Corbett Jr. began what the court had determined should be the remainder of his life. He settled into the institutional environment with the behavioral consistency that had characterized his previous period of incarceration. He was, once again, cooperative. He was, once again, a person who produced the documentation of compliance that institutional management responds to. The model prisoner returned to the institution that had once trusted him enough to give him a work assignment from which he walked away, was back inside the system. What would happen when he became eligible for parole was a question that 1961 left unanswered. The answer would arrive in 1980. When it did, the Coors family would face something the legal system had been unable to prevent: the return of the man who had killed the husband and father they had lost 19 years earlier, to the city where he had planned the killing, to live out the years of his freedom in the same geograph. The Coors family's response to the murder of Adolph III was not visible to the outside world in any single dramatic gesture or stated policy. It was visible instead in the accumulation of changes, in daily habits, in corporate security practices, in the specific quality of the family's relationship to public exposure, that occurred across the months and years following February 1960, and that transformed the family's already significant insularity into something that operated at an entirely different level of intensity. The most immediate change was physical security. Before the morning of February 9th, the Coors family had maintained privacy as an organizational philosophy and a personal preference without particularly maintaining physical security as a daily practice. The assumption underlying their daily lives was that the combination of geographic remove, the estate outside Morrison, was not a property that people stumbled across accidentally, and the family's low public profile made personal security arrangements unnecessary. Adolph III had driven himself to work without a driver, without a security vehicle following his route, without any structured awareness of his pattern of movement's vulnerability. He had been wrong about that assumption after the murder and the trial. That assumption was replaced by something else entirely. family members did not describe these changes publicly, the family's commitment to not describing anything publicly remained one of the few consistent features of their response to the crisis. But people who had contact with the family and with the company in the period following 1961 noted the transformation in terms consistent enough to suggest its character. The children were no longer moved through public spaces without security awareness. The estate was secured in ways it had not previously been. Family members who needed to travel between locations did so with arrangements that accounted for the specific lesson Turkey Creek Road had delivered: a predictable route, driven at a predictable time, in an identifiable vehicle, without protection, had provided everything an attacker needed to plan and execute an approach. The subsequent generation would not be offering that combination of predictabilities again. The company's security culture underwent a parallel transformation. Purdue Pharma's marketing operation this was not. The Coors Company's response was internal and structural, rather than outward-facing. Access to facilities was tightened, information about company operations, family members' roles, and the intersection of the family's daily life with the company's daily operations became even more controlled than it had previously been. If the family's approach to information before February 1960 was cautious, after it was close to total, the specific practices that would eventually draw public and legal scrutiny, the polygraph requirements for employees, the extent of background checking applied to people entering the company's orbit, have their roots in this period. The policies were not created solely in response to the murder. Elements of the control culture predated 1960, but the murder confirmed and intensified the underlying conviction. The company and the family existed in a world that had demonstrated its capacity to reach inside their lives and cause irreversible damage, and every available mechanism for controlling access to that interior was justified. From the outside, these responses are legible as the reasonable adaptations of a family that had suffered a catastrophic security failure. From the inside of the lives being managed, they were also something else: the daily texture of living in the aftermath of violence. Mary Coors lived that texture across the remainder of her life. She was 45 years old when the trial ended in 1961. She had 4 children between 8 and approximately 19 years of age, who were growing up in a household that had permanently reconfigured itself around an absence. The youngest, Spike, had been 8 or 9 years old when his father disappeared. He was entering his 20s when the family had navigated through the investigation, the discovery, the trial, and the early years of living with the verdict. He had spent the most formative portion of his childhood in a household where grief was present in the specific form it takes, when it cannot fully be processed or spoken, interior, structural, and shaping. What Mary Coors specifically communicated to her children about their father, about what had happened to him, and about how to carry that forward is not documented in any publicly available account. The family's commitment to managing their interior privately extended to this most personal of all their interior experiences. But the children who grew up in that household, and who subsequently went on to various roles in the company and in other endeavors, did so with a quality of reserve that people who knew them consistently noted. Adolph Coors IV, the eldest son, the one who bore his father's name and therefore carried the weight of that name most directly, joined the company and eventually rose through its management. People who worked with him described a man shaped by the family's institutional culture in ways that went beyond simple inheritance. The privacy instinct was deep, The wariness of outside exposure was genuine, and the specific quality of someone who has learned, through the most extreme possible demonstration, that the world outside family walls contains genuine danger. Jim Coors and Spike Coors followed different paths in various respects, but the family characteristics that had been intensified by the murder were present in each of them, in ways that contemporaries noted without necessarily connecting directly to the specific events of 1960. The connection was there. It is difficult to grow up in the aftermath of your father's murder without that event organizing the deep architecture of how you understand safety, trust, and the appropriate relationship between your family's interior life and the external world. Mary herself navigated the subsequent decades with the same controlled composure that had been the most visible aspect of her public character through the crisis. She was not a public person and never became one. She did not give interviews about what had happened. She did not participate in the growing documentary and journalistic interest in the case that produced across subsequent decades multiple accounts of the kidnapping and murder. She did not write about her experience. She lived. She raised her children. She maintained her connection to the family and the community that the Coors estate and the Morrison-Golden area represented. She was present at the significant occasions in the lives of her children and eventually her grandchildren. She was, by every account that filtered into the public record through indirect channels, a woman who had made a decision about how to carry what had happened and who had been executing that decision consistently for decades. The specific character of that carrying, whether it involved sustained internal suffering or whether it involved a genuine internal resolution that the exterior composure reflected, is something no public record can establish. It is the most private thing in a family that treated everything as private. What is visible in the public record is the way the family's grief was converted into institutional form. The security arrangements were one expression of it. The political engagement that the next generation of Coors men pursued was another. The specific convictions about the proper relationship between private institutions and government power, about the necessity of strong families and the unreliability of public systems, about the way in which the world requires defense rather than trust. These are not simply political positions held for the usual ideological reasons. They are positions that, in the Coors family's specific case, connect to a direct and documented experience of what happens when you trust the world enough to drive unprotected on a mountain road at a predictable time. The brewery continued. This is the thing that is easy to overlook in the emotional weight of the murder narrative. The brewery had been built by a man who believed in the permanence of what he was building. It had survived Prohibition and the Depression and the death of its founder. It survived the murder of Adolph III as well, not unchanged, not unaffected, but operating. The workers in Golden continued making beer. The trucks continued going out. The 11 western states continued receiving the product. The survival of the company is itself a form of the family's response to the trauma. They did not sell. They did not walk away from the thing that had made their prominence visible and therefore made the chairman a target. They ran it harder. They controlled it more tightly. They converted the loss into a reason for greater intensity rather than into a reason for retreat. Bill Coors and Joe Coors, Adolph III's uncles, the generation that assumed management responsibility as the next generation came of age, brought to the company the specific combination of intense operational focus and deep personal conservatism that the family's culture had always contained and that the events of 1960 had reinforced. The company they managed through the 1960s and into the 1970s was a genuine American success story by the conventional measures. Growing revenues, expanding production capacity, a brand that had achieved a cultural footprint beyond what its market geography should have made possible. The mystique that the 11-state distribution limit created continued generating the desire that unavailability reliably produces. Coors was the beer people talked about in places where you couldn't get it, and that conversation was worth something no advertising could replicate. But inside the success was the specific organizational culture that outsiders increasingly noted. As the company's national profile grew, the polygraph testing, the anti-union stance, the control of information, to a degree that bordered on institutional paranoia, the family's consistent refusal to engage with public scrutiny in the conventional ways that prominent American companies were expected to engage. The culture was not simply an artifact of the family's historical conservatism. It was a fortress. It was what you build when the lesson of your experience is that openness is a form of vulnerability and that the only reliable protection is control. The murder of Adolph III did not create this culture. It intensified it past the point of moderation. Mary Coors lived within and helped maintain this culture across the subsequent decades. She was there for all of it. The company's expansion, the political engagement of the next generation, the labor controversies of the 1970s, the first public stock offering in 1975, the gradual transformation of the brewery from a regional institution into a national competitor. She watched the children she had raised in the aftermath of the worst thing that had happened to their family grow into adults who carried that aftermath in ways she could observe, but not entirely interpret. She died in 1997. She was 81 years old. The man who had killed her husband lived for 12 more years after her death. He outlived her in a Denver apartment, in the city where he had planned the crime, and from which he had fled, and to which he had returned, living the unremarkable final decades of a life that had been unremarkable in its exterior at every point except the specific acts that made it historically significant. She never knew that outcome. She died before it happened. Whether that is a mercy or simply a fact is not a question anyone can answer for another person.